We're thrilled to have you here join us for the 30 Years of Smart Growth, a Davidson, North Carolina case study. Thank you to the Walton Family Foundation for their support of our educational series and webinars such as these. If for those of you who don't know, we are Groundwork. We are incubated under the Northwest Arkansas Council. We're focused on addressing housing attainability in Benton and Washington counties. And the goal of Groundwork is to catalyze production of a variety of well-designed housing options in mixed income neighborhoods for the region's workforce. While we continue to ensure charm and characteristics of each of our communities in Northwest Arkansas remains. Today we have the privilege to be joined by Jason Burdette. He's the Director of Planning at the Town of Davidson. I had the privilege to walk the Town of Davidson with Jason last year when we went to the CNU conference in Charlotte. I believe some of you did as well. And Davidson's a smaller town on the periphery of Charlotte, and it's basically a national model on how smaller towns can really, on towns of burgeoning cities, can leverage growth in their favor. So we thought he'd be a great case study on how our towns can really leverage our growth in their favor. So thank you so much for joining us, Jason. If you can just give a little bit of background on yourself and go straight into the presentation. Again, we apologize for that technical issue.
Sure. Thank you, Isabel. Can everybody hear me? I think that's a yes. Good. Okay. Just a little bit about me. I am a second career planner, and I initially studied international affairs and political science. Did that for 5 years in DC. Realized I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. I've always had an interest in maps and places and cities, and played a lot of SimCity growing up, and then bought a book called So You Want to Be an Architect, because I thought that's what architects did. And then I read that book and I realized I didn't want to be an architect, but there was this field called city planning. So I went back and got my master's at Virginia Tech, worked in the DC, Maryland area for a number of years, and then moved down to Charlotte area in 2004 and landed in Davidson in 2012. I've been the planning director since 2014, so almost 10 years. So we've done a lot of good things over the years, a lot of things that I cannot take credit for, just trying to continue the legacy. We've had some challenges as well. My goal here is that hopefully you can take some nugget of wisdom from this presentation and potentially apply that in your community. Okay, so a roadmap for today's presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of Davidson basics. Why do we plan and how we got here? Some tools used to plan, some success stories, and challenges, as well as lessons learned and takeaways. But before we begin, I know I'm presenting to a lot of folks who might not be familiar with North Carolina, the Tar Heel state. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about our state first. We've got mountains, we've got beaches, we've got lighthouses, we've got the Wright brothers, we've got barbecue. Charlotte is located in what we call the Central Piedmont. It's on the border with North Carolina or South Carolina. Davidson is just north of Charlotte and located probably where that C is on that map. And if you don't learn anything about smart growth today, I've got 5 little things I hope you can take away with you too. 5 products that originated in North Carolina that you might not have known. Pepsi. Pepsi was invented in New Bern, which is North Carolina's first state capital on the coast in 1893. Cheerwine, keeping in the soda themed, Cheerwine is a very unique cherry flavored soft drink developed by the Carolina Beverage Company in Salisbury in 1917. It's a very unique soda sold throughout the Southeast, mostly known in the Carolinas and Virginia. And who doesn't like some Krispy Kreme donuts? Hot and fresh, founded in Winston-Salem in 1937. Despite the name, Texas Pete hot sauce is also from North Carolina, founded in Winston and introduced in 1929 by the operator of a Dixie Pig barbecue stand. And then finally, Mount Olive Pickles, founded in 1920s in Mount Olive, North Carolina, and is the largest independent pickle company in the United States. So if you don't remember anything about smart growth, you've got pickles and Cheerwine. Okay, a little bit about Davidson. Davidson is located 20 miles north of Charlotte. It's part of a larger Lake Norman region. which includes Huntersville, Cornelius, Davidson, and Mooresville. The Lake Norman region has a population of about 100,000. Davidson is the smallest of the bunch at 16,000. Interstate 77 runs north-south out of Charlotte, and it's basically become a local road between Huntersville and Mooresville. We have Lake Norman just to the west of Davidson. We have a historic downtown. We have a Davidson College, and we have a lot of rural areas. So if you look at this map on your right, downtown Davidson is concentrated towards the left. That's our historic downtown. And then it feathers out towards our rural areas and what we call our ETJ, our extraterritorial jurisdiction. These are areas that are not actually in town, but we do have planning jurisdiction over. Like Northwest Arkansas, we do have 3 large employers, though probably quite not as large as your big 3. We have Train Technologies at 1,100, MSC Industrial Direct at 400, and Davidson College at almost 1,000. Okay, so a little more history about Davidson specifically. Davidson College was founded in 1837, and the town actually grew up around the college to support the needs of those who attended college there and who worked at the college. These were your dry goods, your millers, your physicians, your tailors, and your barbers. The railroad arrived in the late 1800s, and the town became a shipping point for cash crops. That was specifically cotton and a service area for local farmers. This was very typical for small railroad towns in the Carolina Piedmont. I mentioned Lake Norman. Lake Norman is not a natural lake. And in 1959, Duke Power dammed the Catawba River, forming Lake Norman, which is now the largest lake in North Carolina. It covers over 32,000 acres and has a 500-mile shoreline. In the last 30 years, the lake has brought a lot of development and development pressure to the region. Okay, so coupled with the college and close access to the lake, I'd say a thriving restaurant scene, greenway networks, and a really charming, walkable downtown. Davidson has become extremely attractive for relocation and development. However, that's not all good. I'd like to argue that we're probably a victim of our own success. We are in the top 5 wealthiest towns in North Carolina, and I wouldn't say that's a great thing. It's made land extremely expensive. Our median home price is more than $600,000. And so there's a large segment of folks who cannot afford Davidson. So more on that later. But we have had some successes, and I think it's also good to toot your own horn occasionally. So we are considered a progressive town in North Carolina, a leader in form-based coding, and in the affordable housing space. We've been honored by both state and national APA, CNU, Smart Growth, and bike and walk friendly groups. So take credit for your wins. That's what we're doing. So when I give presentations like this, typically to civic groups or Rotary groups or what have you, I always ask them, when you think of Davidson, what do you think of? And it was a lot of those images that you saw in that previous slide. It was our walkable downtown, it's the lake, it's the college, it's our restaurant scene, it's the greenways. But I asked them to dial down to our welcome sign because it captures so much. It says, "We are a pedestrian and bicycle friendly community. Please drive carefully." And if you get that right, if you get those fundamental basics right, a lot of the other things specific to land use fall into place. So why do we plan? We had a former mayor who often said Davidson didn't happen by accident. Town leaders and residents made some really bold decisions 30 years ago that have profoundly shaped and influenced today's Davidson. I like this quote by Winston Churchill, of all people, because I think it speaks to the importance of design and designing for the public realm. Davidson was an earlier adopter of form-based code, and that reinforces the elevation of design in our community. And I'll touch on form-based codes in just a few slides. This is another great quote I love from Fred Kent. He's the founder of the Project for Public Spaces. If you plan cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. If you plan for people and places, you get people and places. So he's an urbanist who consults with cities and towns worldwide about best practices in planning and for the public realm. Because if you don't do that, this is your alternative. And I don't think any community wants to live in a place that looks like this. And I didn't realize, I've used this slide for a number of years. I didn't realize Arkansas is actually mentioned here, so I apologize for that. I hope this doesn't look like your community, but it does look like Mooresville, which is 5 minutes up the road. So why do we plan? This is a snapshot of housing units per square kilometer in 1960. I did delineate Arkansas and North Carolina here. And then you'll see the change to 2010 in housing units per square kilometer. I know there's more recent data. I need to get an updated map. But for recent census data, the South is driving the nation's population growth. It's currently the most populated region and accounts for 87% of the nation's growth in 2023, adding 1.4 million residents. The South is attractive. The cost of living is generally cheaper than other places in the country. There's a lot of good job opportunities. You've got weather, you've got the beaches, you've got the mountains. So it's just a very attractive place. North Carolina specifically, we have over 140,000 people moving here annually, and it's the 6th fastest growing state in the country. The South as a whole claims 7 of the top 10 spots of fastest growing states. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of people who want to be here. So that was the macro level. This is our micro level. This is Davidson's planning jurisdiction. So you can see the historic downtown. You can see the intensity of the red far left of the map. The interstate actually crosses our jurisdiction at the far western edge of our jurisdiction, and it feathers out. So this is land cover in Davidson on this micro level in 2001. This is land cover in 2011, and then 2019. So you can see a lot of those trends on that macro level easily translate to micro level in a community like ours. This is Davidson in 1930. That's actually Davidson College. And I wish I had a pointer, but there's a sideways D. You can see Main Street and a sideways D that forms with the Chambers building as the terminal vista for Davidson College. And then our historic downtown is the far right-hand corner of Main Street, right-hand corner of the slide. And that's our Main Street. So that's the emergence of our town to serve the needs of the folks at the college. So that's Davidson 1930. This is Davidson today. Very different. This is our interstate interchange. A lot more people. Even we're only 16,000 people. We've grown exponentially since the early 90s. So I know there's a lot of planners in the room or on this webinar, but I'm going to tell you how we plan specifically. And I don't think this is foreign to anybody. These are our planning foundations. We have our planning principles, which is a policy document, which captures our refined aspirations of who we are and what we want to be. We have our comprehensive plan, which we try to update every 10 years, which we've been successful at doing so. And that's that framework for those refined aspirations, and it captures that vision. And then we have our Davidson Planning Ordinance, or the DPO. That's the legal code. That's the development standards that are going to help us achieve that vision. And then we have various small area plans, which are smaller policy documents, geographically specific frameworks to capture a vision and aspiration for a smaller area. So to better understand Davidson's experience with smart growth, it's important to recognize how we got here. So I'm going to hit on some highlights over the next couple slides to tell a little more about our history specific to smart growth. I keep saying small growth, smart growth. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, Charlotte was really emerging as a national banking center. It's actually the second largest in the country behind New York. And we saw growth and development creeping up I-77 towards Lake Norman and historic Davidson, which was this small historic college town of 4,000 people in 1990. So we've quadrupled in size since 1990. It's a very different time in town where a lot of people lived in town and walked to work, and lots of college professors and staff. So at that time, sensing we're on the precipice of something big with this impending growth. Someone sent the town manager at that time a video of Andres Duani. I think a lot of you might be familiar with him. He's one of the founders of the Congress for New Urbanism and a planner. He did a presentation in Canada, and the town manager gave it to the planning director and literally said, "This is what we need to do." So they were at town-wide meetings. It was a community conversation to ask or to answer three questions. It was, what do we like about Davidson? What would we do differently as we grow if we had the chance? And what do we want to avoid as we grow? So these town-wide meetings affirmed some common values, that being Main Street and our village green and shops were really important, the college, big trees, a sense of community, diversity, narrow streets and sidewalks and front porches, connectivity, commercial industrial tax base, and rural open spaces. These are all things that are really important to us. And essentially, this became our first comprehensive plan. Around the same time, the town officially adopted core values, and these are the ones that speak most to land planning and still hold true today. Davidson's traditional character is that of a small town, so land planning will reflect its historic patterns of village-centered growth with a connection of neighborhoods, conservation of rural areas, and provision of public spaces. Citizens need to move easily throughout town and the region, so government will provide a variety of options such as sidewalks, bike paths, greenways, connected streets, and transit. And Davidson's historic mix of people of all income levels and ages is fundamental to our community, so that town government will encourage opportunities, services, and infrastructure that allow people of all means to live and work here. So now that we've got that policy vision document, how do you implement that vision? So enter the land plan from 1995. It was an evolution of ideas presented in the general plan, but with a greater emphasis on the regulatory mechanisms to achieve those desired outcomes. It was highly illustrative, well, for that time, and contained graphics depicting specific standards set forth in the plan. These included compact neighborhoods, pedestrian-scaled buildings, open space, connectivity, and inclusionary zoning. That is our affordable housing ordinance, which I'm going to dive into in a couple slides. It was at this point that Davidson embarked on a path that was leading away from the conventional development paradigms. The focus shifted toward building form and away from use. And the character of public spaces such as streets and parks were also really detailed. Also of note, because the Davidson land plan was such a change from the existing zoning, the typical zoning of the time, developers were given an option at that time as to which code they could use. So this was essentially the town's entry into form-based coding. I know there's some who on this webinar who were probably form-based code practitioners and could give a presentation on that, but some might not know what it is. So for those who aren't familiar with it, here's your 2-minute elevator spiel. It's a development regulation that focuses on form and design versus use. Typically use-based zoning, which is called Euclidean zoning, came about in the 1920s, New York City, when government, in the interest of health and safety, separated noxious factory uses from residential uses. And then the onset of the automobile just perpetuated the separation of uses over the next several generations. So form-based codes look to go back to how communities were organized for thousands of years. A natural mixing of uses is good urban design. If you get that form right, a lot of other pieces fall into place, and different uses can flex in and out over time based upon market conditions. So you've got your conventional R40 design over here. Euclidean-based zoning. You've got design guidelines in the middle, and then you have your actual form-based code where street and building types or mix of types are specifically called out. Form-based code came out of the new urbanist movement of the early 1990s. Andres Duany was a big player in that. Victor Dover, harkening back to traditional town and city design and mixing of uses. Seaside was the first new town constructed based solely on form-based codes. Is it successful? I think that's debatable. It's a very high-end resort town now, but it looks nice. But it did elevate the conversation as to, hey, maybe towns and municipalities can learn something here about designing for form and not just use. This is a really great diagram from new urbanist firm Dover Cole, illustrating that difference between traditional Euclidean zoning on the left, which had separated uses, single-use development, lack of connectivity, reliance on a few large roads, very auto-dependent, inherently unwalkable, and a lot of residual open space. And this traditional town development supported by form-based codes on the right. It's a mixed-use development. It's compact, walkable nodes, a variety of lot sizes, a network of streets and options, defined public spaces, preserved rural spaces, and I would add a much more efficient use of land. This is also a diagram from DPZ, Andres Duany's firm, that illustrates what we call the transect model. And it's basically supports a logical progression in intensity as one moves from the conservation and rural areas on the left to the much more dense town core. And it's not saying that all cities need to have like 10-story skyscrapers in the middle, but there is some level of density and more intensity of form in this village center as opposed to the conservation and rural areas. Okay, continue with your Davidson history really quickly. This was St. Albans was one of our first form-based codes developed in neighborhoods in town in 1998. It was designed by Miami-based Dover Cole, and because of the overlapping zoning at the time, the developer had one group design it using conventional zoning, and then Dover Cole designed it using a form-based code. And then he let the public vote for it, their preference in a meeting. That's unheard of. That doesn't happen today, but that's what happened in 1998. And at the time, it broke the mold with offices in residential neighborhoods and a public use, a church, given a prominent location in a terminal vista. It was our first townhome. It included townhomes east of our railroad tracks. It had a mix of building types, lot sizes, a good provision of public spaces, multiple connections to existing street network. Affordable housing was integrated into the development. Has it been successful? I would say yes. However, the commercial has not been as successful as intended because it doesn't have that frontage on a primary street, which is Concord Road. It's the commercial is hidden one layer back. It was extremely contentious at the time when it was approved in 1998. But however, some of its biggest critics were the first to move in, and it's one of the most desirable neighborhoods today in Davidson. This is what it looks like today. You've got townhomes, you've got a mix of some small office uses, you've got single family, and it's highly walkable, and you've got some real defined public spaces. Okay, moving on to another case study from that era. 1999 was Davidson Bay. This plan did a really good job of integrating a variety of building types, uses, and public spaces, and it was designed actually by DPZ, Andres Duany's firm. You can see there's some townhomes and affordable housing down here in phase one, a school, play field. You got duplexes over here. We've got townhomes up here. Got townhomes and affordable housing over here. Some quadplexes and affordable housing. We have a commercial node here and single family on the perimeter, and some really good publicly accessible trails right along the lake. And it's actually adjacent to a 20-acre park, which is across the street. There's a lot of good that came out of this neighborhood. Affordable housing on site, a variety of building types, but this started in 1999, and unfortunately, it's still not finished today, 25 years later. It's getting close, um, but I think the 2008-9 recession really did some damage on the timeline, and the developer also was not the most astute. Um, Tell me you haven't heard that before. Um, and partitioned and sold off lots of the development envelopes. Also, the commercial envelope has been reduced over time and has not yet been built yet. So while there's some really good best practices here, there's still some lessons learned and takeaways. Okay, so our planning ordinance in 2001, we're fast forwarding. Davidson went all in on form-based code. It was the second form-based code adopted in the state behind Belmont, which is also a suburb of North Carolina, and it applied to the entire jurisdiction. So it established this form-based unified development code that was design focused, had specifics regarding height, transparency, building elements, porches and stoops. It was all in a single document. It addressed land uses and spatial relationships by encouraging density to support businesses. And actually, we have a minimum two-story commercial building requirement. We know land is a finite resource. We're not growing more land, so we'd rather go up than out with appropriate scale and context. We created flexible street design standards. And again, going back to designing for the pedestrian, a lot of it was pedestrian focused. Front doors on sidewalks, limited setbacks, parking in the rear, and no drive-throughs. We actually banned drive-throughs in town. So we have no drive-throughs in town because drive-throughs put that focus on automobiles and also allow for potential conflicts with cars with the additional curb cuts that they require. So we also required greenway multi-use path construction if shown on adopted plans. Developers weren't just required to provide an easement, they were going to build it because it was an adopted plan. We also addressed design and mixture of uses by emphasizing compatible design, no minimum or maximum densities, lot size varieties. We permitted a range of building types in various planning areas. Those are our zoning districts, we call them planning areas, because they focus on the shape of buildings and public spaces between them, not just a permitted use. So traditional building types of storefront, workplace, live, work, single family. We established a minimum building height, again, the minimum two-story for commercial. And then this was the onset of requiring architectural review. That was our design review board, which is enabled by state statute in North Carolina. So it's a quasi-judicial board that approves all commercial architecture in town, and residential as well. Sorry, anything above is a duplex right now. The design review board has to approve. And actually, we started to spell out in our ordinance exactly what we wanted with these hand-drawn sketches. I think it's really funny if you look at the slide. And I had nothing to do with this, but we also showed what we didn't want to see. Unacceptable down in the right corners. Electrical boxes, no, that's unacceptable. Houses with similar frontages like that, in elevations where the street form becomes monotonous, that's unacceptable. So that was really important, I think, at the time to show people this is what we want and this is what we don't want to see. We actually broke down our building type regulations and got more specific regarding storefront buildings, workfront, live, work, and civic buildings, and described this is how these are the mechanisms that allow a good building to be created. So I think that was pretty ahead of its time in 2001. Again, I just referenced our design review board, a quasi-judicial board enabled by state statute. One of the things we did learn about our design review board is that we need to put in some checks and balances, and that a developer would have to get approval from the design review board, but there was nothing holding them accountable to actually build what they said they were going to build outside of a CO. So now we include a architect's letter of verification when they get an approval, when their plans are approved by the design review board. The architect says, I will build the building as the design review board approved it. And then on the back end, once the building is constructed and they're waiting for a CO, the architect's letter of verification, there's a second one that says the building was built according to those plans, and the architect has to put his seal on there. So there's some real checks and balances, and that's a lesson learned through some mistakes. We also, at that time, the ordinance did a good job at depicting also what we didn't want to see. These include visible false fronts, fake entrances, fake windows, mansard roofs with projecting dormers, and this franchise architecture. Again, it's one-story commercial, but everybody knows what a Pizza Hut was when that Pizza Hut goes away, because Pizza Hut looks the exact same. So it's not to say Pizza Hut can't locate in town. They just need to be in a two-story building, minimum two-story, and they can't have this franchise architecture. And that's to allow market conditions to take over time in a way that's context sensitive to the importance of design. We also made really good provisions for public spaces, described exactly what pedestrian passageways were, clothes, again, greenways requiring construction, parks, squares, and plaza. And we did some cross sections, designing for people and cars, plus bikes and transit. We had a reservation of transit stops too required. And these hand-drawn cross sections, again, it was 2001, but I think this was pretty forward-thinking at the time. And again, going back to designing for the pedestrian, we also enforce stricter pedestrian scale signage. Billboards are not allowed. Internal illumination is not allowed. So signage needs to be pedestrian scaled. I referenced that the building height minimum 2 stories for all commercial buildings. This picture in the middle, this is a conventional strip mall anchored by a Harris Teeter, but it's got frontage on a street. The parking is in the rear, and it's 2 active stories, and it's fully leased out. The image on the left shows we're not opposed to fast food or what have you, but you just need to play by our rules. Subway is located in the first floor of a 3-story building. Okay, so a lot of you might be interested in inclusionary zoning. That's our affordable housing ordinance. It was adopted in 2001, so we're over 20 years into this. It was the first mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinance in North Carolina, and it requires 12.5% of all for sale units in new developments to be affordable based upon an area AMI, up to 120%. The affordable housing was to be integrated into neighborhoods, and it was to be deed restricted for 90 years. So these are some examples, some pictures of our affordable housing units, townhomes, single family home, and a duplex over here, and they are completely integrated into these communities, and walking by, you'd have no idea they're affordable housing. Yes, we've been a leader in the affordable housing space in our state, but I'm not going to say it's perfect. There are definitely some challenges. There is the expressed versus implied authority from the state. One could argue, I could argue this on next Tuesday, is that we do not have expressed authority from state statute that says we can do this. North Carolina is a Dillon's rule state. I think Arkansas is as well. And that you can't do anything that state statute, General Assembly doesn't say you can expressly do. We have taken a broad interpretation of getting implied authority under the general zoning statute of preparing the community for health and wellness and safety. So we have been sued a lot over time. It's never been litigated. We have always settled. So we've found a way to be nimble and pivot and find ways to still achieve what we're trying to achieve, but maybe in an indirect way. Because of one of those early lawsuits, we ended up creating a payment in lieu option. So instead of building those units, you could provide a payment in lieu for each of those required units. That number has fluctuated from 26,000 to 76,000 over years. And it's currently around $50,000. We have another struggle is that we've figured that developers have preferred making that payment in lieu rather than building a unit. Obviously, you can make that payment in lieu for $50,000, much cheaper than you can build a unit. So we've had to pivot again because of that. And now, next slide, I'll talk more about that. We've had trouble meeting our rental needs. This inclusionary zoning only is only specific to for sale units. So that's been a gap in our affordable housing program, as well as land and building costs. I think I referenced early on that Davidson is a wealthy community, and because of that, it's been desirable, and land costs are through the roof. It's much more expensive to develop in Davidson than in any local jurisdiction in our area. However, those are challenges. There are also some opportunities that inclusionary zoning has presented. We have built really strong collaborative relationships with partners. This includes the Davidson Housing Coalition, Habitat for Humanity, and the Davidson Community Foundation. They've been able to plug into places where we have not been able to. We have over 90 units in the town's inclusionary zoning program of almost 4,000 units total, and over 400 in the townwide and partnership program. So that's a good chunk of units as part of our housing stock that are part of our program. The payments in lieu have allowed us to provide support for other critical programs, and not just building units, but other programs that support affordable housing. At one time, we had over $2 million in this fund because you had a large tract builder who wasn't familiar with Davidson would much rather cut that check than make any effort to work with the neighborhood and the community to build units on the ground. And some of those other programs include critical home repairs, down payment assistance, rental subsidies, that's through our partnerships and working with partners. One of the things we just adopted in the last 5 or 6 years, I think, was this built unit waiver incentive. So as I mentioned, we have our inclusionary zoning, but developers found it much easier to just cut a check. But now we have a 2-for-1 built unit waiver incentive, so that if your obligation is 10 units in your development, if you build 5, your obligation is complete. We'd much rather have built units on the ground than $450,000, what have you. So our Board of Commissioners has been committed to affordable housing over many, many years and many different terms and folks serving in that role. This is our second year now of actually having a recurring budget line item of $500,000 into affordable housing to support a number of these efforts I described above. And we had a part-time affordable housing program manager, but post 2020, we actually were able to fund an affordable housing and equity director. So I was going to bring him on to the webinar today, but we just had a change of position. So he's only been with us for 6 weeks now, but he's hit the ground running, especially in the equity space as well. We did do an affordable housing needs assessment in 2022, and our current need is 800 plus. So we are still lacking based upon what our community needs have. We're not hitting those marks yet. We're making progress, but we're not hitting those marks. One of those ways we're going to try to get closer to that number is the development of town-owned land. So we are actually working with a local affordable housing consultant to potentially pursue development of affordable housing on town-owned land. Lastly, that affordable housing needs assessment created this affordable housing framework. These are the 4 buckets. It's because it's not just building units, it's educating, it's creating, it's preserving, and supporting. And this is how our affordable housing program intends to do that, to ensure success now and in the future.
Jason, I have 2 questions for you. One,
sure.
That's on the affordable housing is, were there any state or federal grants available for these projects? Did you guys get any state funding for that type
I'm not the affordable housing expert. I believe there have been home funds that have been used. And and CBDG grants. We've used, I don't know exactly how they were used in what capacity, but yes, there have been some grants that have been secured.
Okay. And then they say, how do you measure your affordable housing need?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I'd have to dive back into the affordable housing needs assessment. I haven't read that in a while, but it's available online.
Okay.
I'd reference that, just townofdavidson.org, affordable housing needs assessment.
Okay, we'll go ahead and share that out with everybody. And
Okay.
then one question that goes back to the billboards and internally illuminated signs that were prohibited. What happened to the existing non-conforming signs and how did that transition work?
That's a great question. Actually, this happened in 2001, 2005, when this was eliminated. So we didn't have billboards in town. We only have a little sliver of interstate, and there's no opportunities for billboard because it's pretty much adjacent to the lake. Um, and we've allowed existing non-conforming signs to exist, but once they go away for, I think it's 60 days, that sign is no longer grandfathered. So I think people understand now that that's an expectation. We do struggle with folks who aren't from the area, and they come in and they submit a sign permit, and it's like, did you read our ordinance? You have no idea. So, and it can be a little bit of a shock for someone who's, I work all over the state. I hear you, but this is the standard we have in our town. So there's an education component there.
Jason, while you're answering questions, can I throw one your way? Thinking of the design review board, how do you ensure that that board does not become a vehicle for NIMBYs to stop development, to slow development? And kind of what role does, now a 30-year history of, this approach to the development play in kind of keeping some of those anti-growth forces at bay?
Yeah, it's a good question. If anything, I would argue that our planning board would be the vehicle. Design review board, like when we put out requests for citizens to join, they're for 3-year terms, and we have a selection committee based upon staff, the advisory board liaison, and 2 commissioners as well. So it's a rigorous, not I would say rigorous process. It's not just sign up and here I am. Like for design review board, we want to make sure you've got some type of design experience. Like so, we've of 12 people on the board now, I think 9 are architects, so that's helpful. So they understand good architecture. The planning board is a little different, in that there have been some NIMBY folks who've been on there. But it's also an education, it's an opportunity for education again. So you bring them along. We don't just throw them to the wolves. My colleague, who's the planning board chair, gives a presentation much like this that says, these are the decisions we made to get to where we are. And you moved here because of these decisions. Right. So you can't just say, pull up the drawbridge, nobody else. But you can say, we can allow intentional growth that's complementary of Davidson. That's a logical extension of our historic town. And that's reinforcing that education component has served us well over the years. You just tell the story and you tell it again and you tell it again and again.
Right. Right. Just repetition.
Yep. So
That's
good
great.
question.
Thank you.
So were there any more questions right now? I think
we're all clear right now.
Okay. I'm going to move forward. Just to give you a snapshot of where we have affordable units in town, they're not just in one area, they're all over town. So I think we've done a really good job at integrating affordable housing units in existing and new developments. Okay, so I'm going to try to fast forward this history. 2015, we update our whole zoning ordinance, we call our DPO, to align with an updated comprehensive plan, various small area plans. And then we recalibrated some of the things, as I mentioned earlier, based upon some lessons learned. One of those things is while we allow a number of building types in any given planning area, people weren't building them. So we now require a mix of housing types in certain areas. So like you need to have some type of attached housing in this planning area because those missing middle building types are typically not in your developer's wheelhouse. You've got to have a specialized developer who knows what they're doing. And then this is when we adopted our affordable housing built unit waiver incentive that I just referenced, because we weren't getting built units on the ground. So as much as we were in the past. So we need to find a way to make it, to incentivize it for developers. So we do various planning initiatives. I think the Circles at 30 is one I like to share too. It was one of the small area plans done in the early 2000s. That's our interstate on the left. And this was a plan to build out this extension of downtown. It's probably 3/4 of a mile from downtown. There's neighborhoods in between, but this could be a holistic neighborhood unto itself, a secondary main street that had commercial businesses, restaurants, schools, and a variety of housing types and public spaces. So that's the Circles at 30 in 2005, I believe. And this is part of the Circles at 30 today. And what I love to share about this is that this is immediately adjacent to an interstate. So I can't think of any interstate interchange in the state of North Carolina where you get off and you are immediately in a pedestrian-friendly environment. Like we don't have your strip McDonald's and what have you, fast food. And that's not to say they can't be here, but they just have to play by our rules. We do actually have a gas station. We have a 2-story gas station. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's it right there. It's a 2-story gas station, and it anchors the corner of this prominent circle. In that ordinance in 2015, we got better at describing what we wanted with our building sketches and our cross sections. Like this is what we want to see, and this is the expectation for your development when it comes in. I do want to share this experience too, because it's a little different, and I'm not sure how dense or rural or anywhere in between your communities are, or the communities on this call. We have as I showed on that transect, we have a rural area that there's a lot of development pressure. So we did a small area plan for a big area for 3,800 acres called our rural area plan in 2017. And we deliberately called it cultivating conservation and quality growth, because we want those two could go hand in hand. So you can see on this perimeter, because the density of Davidson is located closer to that lake on the far west side. But we had folks outside our jurisdiction in Iredell County to the north, Cabarrus County to the east, and Huntersville to the south, that all this development pressure was coming. And you build all those units next to our rural areas, like they're going to have some impacts. So we did this rural area plan. Yeah, this kind of shows it better. All of this was largely undeveloped, these green areas. In the dark green are large public parks. But there was development pressure there from pretty much all sides. So what did we do? We go back to our core values. It says Davidson's traditional character is that of a small town. So land planning will reflect its historic patterns of village-centered growth with a connection of neighborhoods, preservation of rural area, and provision of public spaces. Walkable urbanism doesn't mean just downtown. You can have walkable urbanism in nodes. You can have it in rural areas. And that's what we were able to achieve with this plan. So our goal was to basically conserve 50% of open space in our rural areas. And we ended up rezoning a number of these areas into rural, neighborhood edge, neighborhood general, neighborhood services. So if this were all to be built out with these increased open space standards for each of these specific planning areas, we were going to hit 57%. And then we even recalibrated too. So by implementing this, I think the town took some bold steps as to how we can not only secure but manage open space. We require open space to be publicly accessible, and this was a trade-off for allowing more development. We also now include the preservation of prime agricultural soils to be considered open space, thereby offering support to agricultural-based uses. Second, that open space land must be a permanent conservation easement, and that easement must be accompanied by a long-term maintenance plan, annual monitoring and reporting, as well as funding to ensure that that area is maintained in perpetuity. And we call it a stewardship endowment. We also reinforced third-party conservation standards, taking the emphasis away from us as staff direction and looking at legitimate organizations who do this on the daily and replicating their best practices and emphasizing their standards. We created some new planning areas. Zoning flexibility. We created options in the rural area. So you could develop at 1 unit per 2 acre with 50% open space, or 1 unit per 1 acre with 70% open space, with a payment in lieu allowed for offsite balance. And by tweaking those numbers, actually, our open space goal is now at 63% for this area. It moved up from 57 to 63. We rezoned some of these areas that were previously just rural to like neighborhood edge or neighborhood general to create that logical transect progression. And then we used some overlay districts, specifically a scenic byway overlay district and a rural crossroads overlay district. And the scenic byway, the idea there was to mimic these larger setbacks that were already in place, so that if new development came, it mimicked what was already there from a rural scenic byway standard. It includes the construction or financial contribution towards greenways. And the idea is, again, these roads with the goal of providing multimodal connectivity all the way from downtown to these parks on our eastern edge. And then for the neighborhood services, there is I don't know if I showed it here, but there's an intersection right here, right here, that we've identified as a rural crossroads, kind of like a hamlet. We put in very specific design criteria to achieve this rural crossroads feel and function. It includes height limits and specific building types allowed and minimum commercial requirements to ensure that it functions as this rural crossroads that you see all across our state. So essentially, we rezoned 3,500 acres to secure this vision and planning that was in place. And I think I'll say this was a bold move because we had just redid our planning ordinance in 2015, where we rezoned a lot of areas across the board, and then we did it again 2 years later. And a lot of our citizens were like, "What the heck is going on here?" And they saw it as a land grab, and they saw like a rubber stamp for development, when actually we had to do above and beyond effort to educate our folks as to, no, this is actually like secures quality conservation as well. So that's really kind of cool how those plans come to fruition. Again, we checked in with our comprehensive plan in 2020, and it's interesting that a lot of these things that you saw earlier in 1995, in 2000, 2010 have replicated themselves or have matured a little bit into what's guiding our planning vision and strategies right now. And a lot of that was centered around growth management, because we are growing and people feel that growth management pressure. It led to something called our Conservation and Growth Management Framework, which in turn led to what we call our utility, service, and annexation criteria. I'm going to tell you about that in 1 second. But we want to make sure we're implementing the things we said we're going to implement in our comp plan, so we track it here and give an update annually. And we also educate our folks as to, this is the basis of how you use your vision in your comp plan. You set your priority goals through your comp plan, and then your board of commissioners or your elected body uses that as a menu to set their work priorities in their strategic plan. Obviously, you set funding priorities, budget, you implement, then you assess, measure, and reevaluate. And then you do the whole thing again. And we've been on a 2-year cycle. So this is just so basic, but I think this chart speaks so well as to how we plan, and we can capture this vision and then implement the regulatory framework and then get things accomplished over time. Similarly, mobility is really important in town, and mobility in town, I know I'm running short on time, so I'm trying to speed up a little bit. It's not just vehicular mobility. It does include cars, but it's also ped mobility, bike mobility, and transit. And when we do TIAs, transportation impact analysis, we make sure they get ped and bike counts in there too, to provide a full picture of the impacts on a development. You'll see priority projects from our mobility plan. They're not just concentrated in our historic downtown or walkable downtown. They're all throughout the jurisdiction. And we want to make sure that accessibility, that multimodal options are available to all residents. Again, we're not perfect. We have had 3 pedestrian deaths in the last 10 years in our downtown. That's a horrific figure. You educate your folks, but again, we're a part of a larger Lake Norman region. We have folks who aren't from town passing through all the time. So they aren't familiar with our crosswalk culture, our pedestrian culture. So we adopted a Vision Zero plan last year and then implemented a very public pedestrian awareness campaign called Stop, Look, Wait, which I think has been pretty successful. So again, being flexible and you think you're doing all the things correctly in designing for the pedestrian, there's some unintentional consequences. So, okay, so I'm entering my red era of the presentation. I'm winding down really quickly some success stories. We do have a rigorous ordinance, and that's a good thing. If using a form-based code, make it apply everywhere. Why should downtown be the only walkable place in your city or town? Don't people who live further out on that transect deserve or want some modicum of walkability too? And so through our planning ordinance, we've been able to achieve a high degree of walkability and connectivity through our town. Detail what you want, show them what you want, be specific, show them what you don't want too. Show pictures. Our affordable housing ordinance has been, I think it's a success story, though it does walk a fine line with our state legislature, but we've also been able to pivot and be flexible and secure affordable housing for folks in our neighborhood, in our community. Plan for sidewalks, greenways, multi-use paths. Beyond recreation, greenways have the capacity to be vital transportation infrastructure. Adjacency to greenways bring value to homeowners. I can't say that enough. It is desired that they are good things. And make your developers build them. Put them in plans and make your ordinance say that if it's shown in a plan, developer has an obligation to build it. The administrative versus legislative track. I know this varies between communities. Davidson was for the longest time, pretty much everything went legislative. That means it required commission approval. We changed that in 2009 because the bottom fell out on the economy and we were trying to incentivize development, get people back to work. So everything went administrative unless special cases required a conditional approval. Now we're somewhere in between, but in Davidson, the legislative process is very onerous and very time consuming. Developers don't like that. We know that. So that's why we've been able to elevate things in our ordinance, knowing that it's rigorous, but they'd much rather do the administrative track than the legislative track. Okay, I referenced this earlier. The utility service annexation criteria, this is a success story. It came out of multi-year concern over growth management and exploring a number of growth management tools. So what we've basically done is we've created, the developers are required to submit this scorecard based upon what we've said are important to us. It's grounded in our comprehensive plan. And it's for utility extension, which that decision had previously resided with our Board of Commissioners. We've basically said, if you score 60% based upon eligible points of things that we've already said are important to us, grounded in our comprehensive plan and supported by our citizens, your utility decision is administrative. It's not legislative. So that kind of buffers us against the whims of a NIMBY getting elected. If you're hitting these marks, and one of those incentives is building affordable housing on the ground in your development. That's something we've said is important to us, and that's something where you can get points on this USAC scorecard. So You're not going to be dinged against points that you're not eligible for. Like preserving historic resources is important to us. If you don't have historic resources on the site, you're not going to get points taken away. It's an additive um, criteria. And again, that focuses that directs folks to an administrative track. USAC outcomes, we've only had it adopted for a year and a half now, but what I've heard from the development community already is expectations. It sets clear expectations for all parties involved. There's predictability with all stakeholders. We're equipping and educating project teams and stakeholders with reminding them of why we have our comprehensive plan and what's important to us. And then we're incentivizing these things that are important to us to enable better development. And by and large, it's improved our process because this water sewer decision that was legislative for a while became really cumbersome and unpredictable. Success stories, again, I talked about that rural hamlet and the rural area plan. We're going to put this here based in our rural area plan is based upon Serenbe, which is a community outside Atlanta. That was in our rural area plan. It was an agrarian community and on a rural hamlet. Okay, we actually have a developer coming in and doing this now. It's a local developer who understands Davidson. They have a business called Summit Coffee that's branched all throughout the Southeast now. And they want to build this neighborhood services node, complete with a coffee shop, a roastery, a brewery, small inn, affordable housing, working agricultural fields, and a mix of housing types. We're like, oh my gosh, we didn't think anyone would actually build what we said they would in our rural area plan. It was literally a pipe dream. And we had a Davidson developer understand that. Like, I want to do that. So it sailed through the legislative process. It actually had to go legislative for a couple of variances they needed. And the community is, by and large, extremely excited about this development. Success stories, again, we have a very engaged citizenry. Living in a college town, that's to be expected. We have lots of experts in town, or so-called experts. So put them to good use. If you have those folks in your town, bring them along, make them champions. That includes appointing them on your advisory boards. We have a number of advisory boards that we use and engage citizens in regularly. All of these boards meet at least once a month, and then plug those advisory boards into your process. So they're validated, they feel part of the process, and they can take ownership of, oh yeah, I was part of that decision that helped make this project better. Active transportation, we are a very bike and pedestrian-friendly community. We have created a culture where this is the expectation, not the rarity. I think interstate exit at circles at 30 is a really good example. The college, historic downtown, newer and established neighborhoods, that degree of walkability is expected. Design matters, going back to form. These are existing buildings and proposed buildings, and they all have a high degree of walkability and form and design that really enhances that public realm. That's actually the top left corner is a closer shot of our 2-story gas station with the pumps in the back. It looks like a deli. I remember the first time I drove into town, I'm like, oh, I really want to eat there. I'm like, oh, it's a gas station. Check it out. But it's really high quality design. Challenges. Sometimes you think you know what your community wants, and then you are way off base. About 10 years ago, we had an idea to leverage town assets in our historic downtown to create a new town hall, a hotel, all walkable, good form. People hated it. That was terrible. And we heard loud and clear that historic downtown was different. And so we backed away from it. Similarly, we had a church try to buy some land from us at Beatty Park, this Beatty land, 17 acres. And we didn't want another non-tax-paying entity to take ownership of it. So we're like, let's put something out there. We want affordable housing. We want to preserve a park. We want some commercial. People hated that too. So it actually birthed this NIMBY Save Davidson group, which completely upset our board of commissioners. And that's the next one, politics, 2-year terms. 2-year terms are terrible because educating folks takes so much time. and getting them up to speed. We've now moved to a staggered 2 4-year term or 4-year terms. So there'd be staggered. That's coming up next year. We have pressure, moving on, village infill pressure. We call the area around our historic downtown the village infill, highly walkable. There is so much pressure to tear down 1960s ranchers and subdivide, build 3 houses that are 4,000 square feet each. That's tough. And we're trying to explore tools to not allow that to be the norm. High cost of land, I mentioned that earlier. Bus stop infrastructure and lack of mass transit. We're beholden to CATS, which is the Charlotte Area Transit System, and they've not done a good job at connecting us to the rest of the region. Small town reality versus suburban expectations, that's specific to parking. A lot of folks want to park in front of their destination because that's what you do in the suburbs. But if you were in downtown Charlotte and you had a parking spot 5 minutes from your destination, you'd be like, yep, that's a great spot. So I say we have a walking problem, not a parking problem. So there's that. West Davidson is our historically Black neighborhood that worked a lot of jobs at the service jobs at the college for many, many years. That neighborhood is dying out. Their children are leaving and they're not coming back to Davidson. So we're trying to figure out how we can preserve their stories and the buildings and what that Black community brought to Davidson for generations without alienating them. And also I mentioned our state legislature being a Dillon's Rule state. It's hard to navigate state legislature that wants to have a heavy hand. Okay, lessons learned. This is it. I've got 6 or 7 of these. Make form-based codes applicable everywhere. This is our planning areas map. Some might call it a zoning map, but it's also our future land use map. We've already said exactly what we want and where we want it, and it's all based upon this form-based code being applicable everywhere. Sometimes you need extra regulation. Form is great, but sometimes people get their form right, but still the use, while it's secondary, doesn't fall into place as you had hoped. This insurance company built this 3-story building in downtown. He said, yeah, we're gonna do a restaurant down on the first floor. That sounds great. It's a permitted use. They put in their insurance welcome desk down there. So that's not a highly visible use, doesn't have a lot of pedestrian traffic. It's basically a black hole. So we implemented a retail frontage overlay districts in areas that we specifically want to be pedestrian and have active pedestrian fronts. It needs some extra regulation too. Again, I mentioned earlier that we weren't getting some of these mixed building types, missing middle. So we're requiring more of a variety of building types in specific planning areas. It's not everywhere, but it's in targeted places where they could be context appropriate. Also, I mentioned the demolitions and the building of new homes downtown. Oh, I think that just ended.
We're still on, Jason.
Oh, you're still on? Sorry, I lost my screen went blank. You're still on. Good. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I'm almost done. So we implemented basically a conservation overlay district. It's called our village infill. And we want to make sure that new homes are constructed are context sensitive to what's already there. So it's mass scale setbacks based upon existing context. I cannot advance my slide. There we go. Sorry about that. Allow ADUs everywhere. I didn't even touch on that at all, but we've allowed them everywhere for 25 years, and they're not a problem. They actually help with that naturally occurring affordable housing. Create streets where people and your front doors want to be. This is the same intersection. Nobody wants to hang out in that upper picture. This one, the lower picture looks a lot more desirable. Similarly, this is the same cross section. Create streets where people and front doors want to be. This is in Davidson, exactly. This is a secondary street that actually serves as a primary street on the west side of town. Because of our street connectivity and grid network on this side that's been built in the last 20 years, we can shut this street down and people want to hang out here. And it's been a wildly successful concert series in the summer here. I mentioned this earlier. Tell your story to builders, developers, and the public. This is why we do this, and tell that story over and over and over again. This is our recent Civics 101 class. So we do this once a year for 8 weeks where various departments come in and share a little bit more about local government. It's been a great program. Use your comprehensive plan as a menu for your strategic plan. This is what your people have said are important to you. This is how you implement that vision you said you want to achieve, and track it, and tell your folks what you do and what you've accomplished every year, and tell them what you're still working on. And with new commissioners, new board members, make sure you give them a copy on their first day. Say, hey, this is what we use. I make sure I do that every election cycle, so they have full access to what our community has said is important to us. It's okay to say no. Make bold decisions. I always show this picture and ask Davidson residents, where is this in town? It's not in town because 20 years ago, CVS tried to locate in our historic downtown with their, hey, we've got a perfect template that works everywhere. 1 story, parking in the front. Of course, we need our drive-through. We said no. They actually came back like 5 years later. They built a 2-story building, parking in the rear, no drive-through, and it looks like it's been there for 50 years. They have their Southeast Regional headquarters on the 2nd floor, and it's one of the highest grossing CVSs in the Southeast. So it's okay to say no to get what you want. And lastly, going back to that sign, I said the welcome sign, welcome to Davidson, designed for the pedestrian, and by default, the public realm, because by doing that, a lot of these other pieces fall into place. You might need to pivot, you might need to be flexible because of new challenges or what have you, but if you get these basic pieces right, it's a fantastic foundation for creating good places. Because if not, that's the place you're going to create, and nobody wants to live there. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Jason. We do have a few questions. I know we're a little bit over time, but thank you for those who have stuck by. We're also opening it to questions now. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one that came in. Is you mentioned earlier that the median home prices was $600K. With affordable housing in this equation, what is the average price per square foot in the current market for single family homes? Do you have that handy, or?
Unfortunately, I don't have that handy, but let me write that down. I can get that information for you.
Yeah, perfect. And I did share, just so you know, the affordable housing assessment in the chat. Burnette says, could you give an example of a third-party org that reviewed whether developers met the standards? And I think he's probably talking about the design review board.
I think you're talking about conservation standards. So we used, I can't even think of the name. I can find that name too. It was a North Carolina-based conservation group that created standards for stewardship of open space. And we're like, okay, good. Someone's already created this. It's not us saying it, and we can reference that document because they hold all the best practices. I can find that out for you.
Perfect. So Damien Gallo says, how does the city encourage the type of construction that is best for everyone? Have Davidson's building codes been updated to allow for different type of housing options? And I think you can go into that, but yes.
Yeah, actually, so we use Mecklenburg County building code. We're a small community, 16,000 people. We just make sure we allow for the variety of building types that we want to see in town, and recognizing that storefront buildings aren't acceptable everywhere. They're acceptable in these 3 or 4 planning areas, but they're not the only building that's allowed there. You could have a workplace building there, so we try to be flexible. That's inherent to the form-based code.
Yeah. Nicole Gibbs, who's here with our regional planning, says, what is the staff structure planning culture like in Davidson? How big is the planning department, and what is the interaction like interdepartmentally? Is there a general internal buy-in to these planning policies?
Yes and yes. So we're a staff of 5. I've got it's me. I've been here 12 years. I have a principal planner who's been here 8 and a senior planner who's been here 7. To me, that's like they are the core. They have they have bought in, and one of them, unfortunately, I don't live in town. I live 2 towns over because Davidson's so damn expensive. But I do have my principal planner. He actually went to Davidson College, and then moved away to DC and came back. He moved here specifically because of that culture. He bikes to work every day. That's awesome. So he's bought in, my senior planner. Then I've got new folks who aren't as familiar with Davidson, but that's part of my job as a leader in the department to really reinforce why we do the things we do and why we're not like Huntersville, why we're not like Mooresville. And it's okay. We've forged a different path, and that's important too.
Great. And then we do want to have one last question. How do utility companies and utility placements play into these standards and requirements? And I believe, Taylor, if you can maybe give a little bit he's talking about the standards, the conservation standards.
The conservation standards and utilities. Well, that's a good one. I don't know if I could specifically speak to that. We do have Piedmont Gas has a massive easement on the east side of our jurisdiction. We try to cooperate with it. They don't allow us to cross the easement, or it'd be perfect to use an easement for a greenway, but they don't allow that. You can cross it perpendicularly. And they've generally been receptive to that. Sometimes it takes some extra coordination.
Okay, he actually clarified and said more referring to a set of placements for sewer, water, sewer, and electric.
So water and sewer is managed by Charlotte Water, and that's our local utility. And so they manage water and sewer access for the entire region. We have good relationships with them. They keep us up to date, and we keep them up to date on development and how their CIP, capital improvement plan, is what they have on their CIP and how it might impact what we're doing. So I'd say Charlotte Water is a long-standing good relationship, but requires a lot of coordination. As far as Duke Power, my colleague next door, who's not in the planning department, is the one who deals with them. If you got specific power-related questions, I'd love to bury our power lines. And that's the quickest, but probably most expensive streetscape improvement you can make. Bury power lines and require street trees.
Jason, while we're talking about interdepartment coordination, there was a question earlier just in the chat asking about increase in population often correlates with increase in crime and other issues. To kind of shift that slightly to a more planning focus, what is, kind of that coordination with the emergency response department? How siloed is the planning department from those, and how are you viewing growth as it pertains to these other departments and other concerns in Davidson, such as public safety?
That's a great question. I would say our culture here in Davidson is very strong, and it's not siloed. Like we have a department head meeting every Wednesday morning. So we are sharing information with department heads once a week, if not more, on need based. But if I've got a new development coming in, they're going to hear about it early. And if they've got concerns about it, I'm going to hear them early, specific to public safety and fire. Right. And also we do something called an interdepartmental review. So once we have an official application for a project, so we'll do our analysis or whatever, but we'll share it with all of the departments. So they're all touching it too. And like maybe fire saw something that I wasn't aware of that we need to address. So I say it's a very collaborative relationship. Yeah, it's a good relationship.
That's terrific. And just before we let you go, if I could just ask one more question. We, as I shared before, we're a region situated, on a north-south interstate. We're facing massive growth, and our outlying communities, the reality is, are going to absorb much of the coming growth. What are your just kind of 3-minute thoughts on what that opportunity presents for these outlying communities, before the growth truly sets in, what are your thoughts on how they best prepare themselves for that?
That's a great question. It's funny that Lake Norman is a really good case study in that, where Davidson 30 years ago kind of reevaluated, okay, we see this coming. Who are we and what do we want to be? And did that and captured that and codified that in our regulatory framework. Other communities, I'll not name them, but to the south of us, have been like, oh, we see this growth. Okay, approve, approve, approve. Growth means tax-based, whatever. I wouldn't chase the almighty tax dollar when you sacrifice who you are for sacrificing who you are as a community. Like, you don't want to lose, like, each of your communities have unique identities that sets you apart from your neighbor. So don't lose that, because there's some communities right around here that they blend right together. You have no idea which is which. But when you come into Davidson, you know you're in Davidson because of those decisions that were made. So I think all growth isn't good growth. I always use the word deliberate and intentional growth. Make sure it's growth that you want, because you don't have to say yes to everything. Find a way to say no, or find a way to push in a different direction, and make sure you've got the regulatory framework to back you up. And hopefully that regulatory framework is grounded in something like a comp plan that says, this is who we are, and this is what we want to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
That's terrific. Thank you.
I think that concludes our webinar. I know we went a little bit over, so thank you to everybody who stayed on and listened. We will be sharing this recording with everybody along with a survey. So if you attended, please go ahead and fill out our survey. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much to Jason. This was incredible. I really learned a lot, and I'm hoping everybody else did as well. If you have any questions or concerns, you can see Jason's email there on the screen. Again, thank you so much. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.